In this story, a woman condemned to a life of enforced silence is brought before a dying sovereign to save an empire built on magic. She was accused of destroying, and the man who put her in chains is sitting at his right hand, smiling, waiting for her to speak. In the Valdine Empire, your word was your bond, and that was not a saying. It was not a proverb some cautious grandmother had passed down through the generations so that children would learn to mean what they said. It was a physical, documented, blood-sealed fact of life. When two Valdini parties made an agreement that mattered, a trade route, a military alliance, a marriage contract, a land claim, they did not simply sign their names and trust the other party to be honorable. They pressed their thumbs to wax inscribed with oath script and spoke their intentions aloud in front of a certified arbiter, and those words became binding in a way that no court, no army, and no amount of money could undo. The Oath Network, they called it. 300 years of accumulated agreements, each one anchored to the next, the whole structure ultimately rooted in a single point, the sovereign's blood. Every oath made in the empire passed through the network and found its final anchor in the sovereign's oath thread. As long as that thread held, the empire held. It was an elegant system. It was also, as Zara Fen had spent the last 14 months discovering in exhausting detail, a system that became catastrophic when the right person decided to quietly take it apart from the inside. She had not been that person. She needed that understood. She had been saying it in her head. In the notebooks she filled with the writing habit of someone forbidden one language and compensating in another. In every version of the argument she had rehearsed 1,000 times in the dark for 14 months. The iron speaking ring at her throat saw to it that she had not been able to say it anywhere that mattered. The ring was 2 fingers wide, fitted to the base of her throat, sealed with a ward she didn't have the training to break. It didn't cause pain. It simply made speech impossible. Words rose and hit the ward and flattened, the way a wave hits stone and dies. She had worn it for 14 months. For 9 years before that, she had been a treaty scribe, a woman whose entire professional existence was built on the precise and consequential use of language. The silence the ring imposed was not merely a physical discomfort. It was a specific, deliberate unmaking of everything she was. She was in the Vow-Pits, in the labor colonies of the Eastern Province, when the soldiers came. She had grown competent at rope work. She had grown very good at silence. She had not grown, despite a great deal of effort, comfortable with either. The soldiers arrived on a morning that had been entirely ordinary until it wasn't. And Zara Fen, setting down the rope she was making, felt what she had not allowed herself to feel in 14 months. The particular and terrifying sensation of a story that had not finished with her yet. Chapter 1. The document bore the sovereign's seal, a wave broken over a closed fist, gold wax with the deep blue ink of an imperial directive, and it was addressed to her by name. That alone made it unusual. The Vow-Pits did not deal in names. You were your number, your work assignment, your daily quota. Your name was something that existed in the world before the pits, and would, in theory, be waiting when your sentence ended, assuming you hadn't forgotten how it fit in the meantime. The soldier who handed her the document was young, and had clearly been briefed on the sensitivity of his mission, which he was managing by being extremely precise about every single word. You're to be transferred to the capital immediately. The sovereign requires your expertise. She looked at him. She could not speak. She raised her eyebrows with a deliberateness that communicated her full reaction to that sentence. I understand your circumstances are... He stopped. Started again. The speaking ring remains in place for the transfer. The sovereign will address its removal personally. She read the document twice. It said almost nothing. Her name, the directive, the seal, and one phrase she read 3 times, because it was the most extraordinary thing she had encountered since arriving here. Sentence suspended pending review. pending review. 14 months ago, the High Arbiter himself had read her verdict in a voice like warm timber and told the assembled court there was nothing to review, that the evidence was conclusive, that the dissolution of the High Treaty of the Six Lords, which she had been transcribing aloud when it shattered, was deliberate sabotage, not accident, that the 3 lords who died when their oath bonds snapped had been killed by her recklessness. The mark on her sternum, the Voidspeaker's brand, a black circle broken on one side, like a ring with a crack through it, had been cited as physical evidence of her nature. A woman born with the capacity to dissolve binding oaths by voice alone. A weapon wearing a scribe's clothing, given access to the most significant treaty in a generation. She had been unable, at trial, to explain the mark. She hadn't known what it was. She'd carried it since birth, always covered, always dismissed as a birthmark when anyone saw it. She had not known it was anything at all until the treaty shattered around her and the court looked at her with the faces of people who had just found the answer they needed. She collected what she had: 4 pens, 2 inkwells, 3 notebooks filled with the observations silence produces, and followed the soldier out of the pits without looking back. She had learned, in the harder stretches of her life, that looking back at what you were leaving was a form of damage you chose to do to yourself. The journey to Valdine City took 6 days by sea. She stood at the ship's rail for hours, watching the water, the ring against her throat and the wind speaking for her, thinking about what a man who ran an empire on bound oaths could possibly want from a woman convicted of destroying them. The city arrived like a declaration. White stone and blue harbor, trade ships flying the flags of a dozen nations, the Sovereign's Keep rising from the harbor's head on a wedge of rock that looked grown rather than built. She had been here before twice during treaty negotiations, years ago. She had loved it then for the sound of it. The market calls, the harbor noise, the layered chaos of a city that made no apologies for being loud. It was quieter now. Not obviously, not in a way a stranger would name, but in the way a body is quiet when something at its center is slightly wrong and the edges haven't yet found the language for it. She noticed it. Filed it. A woman named Lenne met her at the harbor, 50, composed, with the particular bearing of someone who had spent 30 years adjacent to significant power and had long since stopped being surprised by it. She had been managing the logistics of this situation, she said, and needed Zara to cooperate with the sequence of events without asking questions she couldn't yet answer. Zara looked at her steadily and nodded. "Good," Lenne said. "Because the situation is more complicated than your transfer document suggests, and there is one thing you need to understand before you enter that keep." She paused. Whatever you believed about the High Treaty's dissolution, the verdict, the court's conclusions, be willing to hear something different. Zara stood in the harbor light with the ring at her throat and the city quiet around her. The mark on her sternum pulsed once warm, sudden as though something ahead of her had reached through a door and knocked. She followed Lenne inside. Lenne was more than a logistics coordinator, Zara would come to understand. She had served the keep for 3 decades, had known Kale's father, had navigated the court's internal geography through 2 sovereign transitions and a war, and her specific skill was knowing which pieces of information to give, and when, and in what order. She gave them now with the precision of someone who had been preparing this briefing for weeks. The Oath Network was failing. 47 unexplained dissolutions in 6 months. The Sovereign had been investigating quietly, without alerting the court, because the failure pattern suggested an internal source. He needed someone who could read corrupt oath script the way a physician reads a symptom, not to describe it, but to trace it back to its cause. Every qualified expert in the Empire either served the court's official channels or owed their position to the High Arbiter's recommendation. Zara stopped walking. "He needs someone who cannot be affiliated with the system she's examining," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended the ring off for only 6 days, her vocal cords still finding their range. Yes, Lenne said simply. And someone whose motivation for finding the truth is not professional, personal. She looked at Zara. He believes the same person responsible for the network's degradation was responsible for what happened at the treaty session. He believes your conviction was not an accident. They walked the rest of the corridor in silence. At the archive door, Lenne stopped. He will explain the rest himself, she said. I will tell you one thing more. Whatever you feel when you are in that room, whatever the mark does, tell him. He needs the full picture. A pause. He is the most honest person I have worked for in 30 years. Meet him at that level and the next 14 months will go differently than the last. She opened the door. Chapter 2. The Sovereign received her in the treaty archive. Not a throne room. The archive 2 floors below the main keep. Every binding ever made under the Valdine system preserved in temperature-controlled drawers along stone walls that went up further than the lamplight reached. The air was dry and still, and carried the specific quality of a room designed to stop time. He was at the central table when she arrived, 2 open ledgers in front of him, the expression of a man who has been looking at the same information so long it has stopped being information and started being weight. Cale Dorn was 37, younger than she'd expected when she first saw his face, and then older when she looked more carefully older, in the particular exhaustion of someone managing something enormous and doing it quietly because they cannot afford for the size of it to be known. He turned when she entered, looked at the speaking ring first not unkindly, but directly, with the attention of someone who has decided something is relevant before they look at anything else. Then at her face. Zara Fen, he said. Sit down, please. She sat. She folded her hands and waited. She was aware of the shelves around her row after row of bound oaths, with a hunger she had been managing since the conviction. I'm going to tell you something very few people in this empire know, he said. He sat across from her and folded his own hands. The mirror of her posture was not deliberate, she was fairly sure. It was simply how 2 people sat when they were both used to being the most careful person at a table. The Oath network is failing. The archive was absolutely still. Not visibly. Not yet. But in the past 6 months I have documented 47 instances of oath dissolution across the empire. Agreements that simply unwound, without cause, without any formal release process. He paused. An oath properly bound in the Valdine system does not simply unwind. The network does not permit it. The anchor holds. He looked at her. Unless the anchor itself is compromised. She held his gaze. She understood where this was going. She thought about 14 months in the pits, about the treaty dissolving around her, about the mark pulsing warm in the harbor an hour ago, and she was very careful not to let her face say more than she had decided to say. You were convicted of dissolving the High Treaty, he said. I have spent 3 months reviewing the full trial transcript. The evidence the court called conclusive was, in fact, selective. He opened the ledger and turned it to face her. My court scholar found something different before he died. He showed me what the treaty actually contained at the time of its dissolution. She read the passage. She had 9 years with treaty documents and oath script, had read them the way most people read letters. She read what he had shown her, and felt the color leave her face. You see it, he said. She pressed 2 fingers flat on the table and slid them toward the passage. Looked at him. The gesture said everything the ring prevented her from saying. There was a null clause buried in the treaty, he said. A corruption in the oath script placed deliberately that turned the treaty's binding into a mechanism for extracting life force from anyone who swore under it. Designed to kill them slowly, over months. The 3 lords who died when the treaty dissolved. He stopped. They did not die because of the dissolution. They died because the dissolution came too late. The null clause had already activated. Zara sat with this. The archive hummed. "You didn't destroy the treaty," he said. "You broke the mechanism that was killing people." He held her gaze. "What I have spent 3 months trying to understand is how, and why the Voidspeaker's brand is the correct name for a woman who, by every piece of evidence I have, did not void anything." She healed it. The mark blazed so hot she pressed her palm flat against it through her shirt. He saw the gesture, said nothing, waited. She pulled out a notebook, opened it to the page she had written on the ship, anticipating this moment, because anticipating conversations she could not participate in was the only remaining way she had of participating in them. She turned it to face him and pointed to one passage. "The mark was always warm when I worked on corrupt documents. I thought it was coincidence. I thought many things. Before I understood, I had been trained not to look at it." He read it twice. "You didn't know what the mark was when you transcribed the treaty." She shook her head. "But it activated anyway, because the corruption was present." She nodded. "And something in the mark responded without your direction," he said. He was not asking anymore. He was confirming the shape of something he had already built in his mind and was now testing against the original. Because that is what the mark is for. He reached across the table, his thumb pressed to the ward seal at the ring's base, the sovereign's thumbprint, the only print that could dissolve it, and the ring came loose. She sat very still. "Take your time," he said. He meant it plainly. Without performance. She opened her mouth, drew a breath that was fuller than any breath she had taken in 14 months, as though her body had been compensating for the restriction so completely it had forgotten what free felt like. "The null clause," she said. Her voice came out lower than she remembered, rough at the edges. Whoever placed it there still operating. Still in the network. She steadied herself. "The 47 dissolutions you're describing aren't random degradation. Someone is targeting specific bindings, working from inside." He went very still. "The same person who poisoned the treaty," she said. "They adjusted when I disrupted the first attempt. Found a slower method." She looked at the ledger. "Can I see the full list?" He turned it to face her. She read, and as she read, the mark on her sternum burned with a warmth that was not she was starting to understand. Slowly, carefully, only a response to corruption. There was something else in it. Something directional. She filed this, returned to the page. "I can find it," she said. "Whatever is being done to the network. I can read the corruption in the script the way I read a misdrafted clause." She met his eyes. "But I need full access to the archive. And I need to know who in your court had access to the High Treaty during the 4 months between its drafting and the ratification session." He reached for a new page and wrote 3 names, turned it to face her. She looked at the names. She kept her expression exactly level. But the mark answered one of those names with a heat so pronounced it was almost painful, and she pressed her palm to her sternum and thought, "Not yet. Not until I can prove it twice." "Where do I start?" she said. "Here," he said. "Tonight." He looked at her with the direct, careful attention she would come to understand was simply how he operated, not performance, not warmth deployed as a strategy, just someone paying genuine attention. "I'll make sure you have everything you need." She was already reaching for the ledger. Chapter 3. She worked through the first night and all of the second day. The archive gave up its secrets slowly. She had to earn them pulling ledger after ledger, cross-referencing dissolution dates against original binding dates, building the pattern by hand the way you build something that needs to hold weight. There was no shortcut. She had always known that about treaty work. The truth was always in the 3rd layer, never the 1st. By the end of the second day, she had it. The 47 failed oaths were not random. They shared one characteristic that took her 3 readings to be certain she was seeing correctly. They all connected, at varying distances through the chain of oath threads linking every binding to every other, to the trade routes of the Eastern Corridor. Not directly, not obviously, but traceable. The way a crack in a wall traces back to a single point of stress if you follow it far enough. Someone was dismantling the Eastern Corridor's oath infrastructure, one thread at a time, choosing bindings that looked unconnected and were, in fact, pulling out the foundations of every agreement that kept the Empire's most profitable routes functioning. She took this to Kale. She found him in the war room, not alone. 2 military advisors she recognized from the briefing documents Lenne had given her, and 1 man she recognized from her own history and had to work hard to keep that recognition off her face. High Arbiter Solan Veth. He was exactly as she remembered. 60, slight, the unhurried manner of a man who had spent a career being the most trustworthy person in any room he entered and had become it so completely the manner was simply him now. He looked at her with warm eyes and said, "Zara Fen, I'm glad to see you well. This has been a troubling business." She looked at him. "High Arbiter," she said. Nothing more. Just his title, returned to him simply. The way you return something that doesn't belong to you. She presented her findings without speculating about the author. She laid out the methodology, which bindings, in what sequence, with what cumulative effect, with the precision of a scribe presenting terms. Careful, without emphasis. Solan Veth listened with the genuine thoughtfulness of a man encountering new information and processing it well. He asked good questions. He suggested 2 further lines of inquiry that were, on the surface, entirely reasonable. They would also, if she followed them, pull her attention away from the specific section of the archive where she had found, the previous night, the oldest entry that bore his notation. She noted this, filed it, said nothing. "Remarkable work," Solan told her. The warmth in it was real. That was the worst thing about him, it was always real. "It's a shame it took this long to bring your expertise to bear." He said it without cruelty. He genuinely meant it. She thanked him, collected her notebook, left. She went straight back to the archive and pulled the file she had found the night before and read it again with the full attention of someone who has just confirmed her starting suspicion and is now building what cannot be argued away. 4 more hours. By the end of them, the notebook had 12 pages, and the mark on her sternum had been burning so steadily the heat had become simply part of the room. She found Kale. He was in the archive already. She had not expected this at the far table with a ledger she hadn't yet requested, which meant he had been pulling the same thread from his end. He looked up when she came in. "Eastern Corridor," he said. "I found 3 more. The pattern goes further back than 6 months." "I know," she said. 2 years and 4 months. The first dissolution happened 44 days after the High Treaty ratification session. She opened her notebook to the first page. "After the dissolution that was attributed to me." He went completely still. "It was always 2-stage, she said. "The null clause was the first attempt. When I accidentally broke it, and it was an accident, I need that said plainly, whoever placed it adjusted, switched to a slower method. Less dramatic, harder to identify, requiring more time." She looked at him. "But the same target, the same end. An empire whose binding architecture has been dismantled oath by oath until the network's foundation can't hold the sovereign's anchor." His voice was even. "Until the empire comes apart." "Yes." She turned the notebook to face him. "I know who is doing it." Chapter 4. She told him everything. The file, the notation, the pattern in the dissolution choices that touched Solan Veth's jurisdictional history everywhere it mattered. The annotation she had found in the oldest file written in his hand. describing the Empire's binding architecture not as a legal instrument, but as a system of control that had grown beyond its original intent. She told him about the courtroom, about standing there 14 months ago while Solan Veth read her verdict in that calm, unhurried voice, and told the court the evidence was conclusive. She put every piece on the table and then sat very still and waited. Cale read every page of the notebook. He read it the way he read everything, not skimming, not looking for the summary, going to the source language every time. She watched his face do the work of absorbing it, adjusting his entire understanding of 2 years against what he was reading. The controlled surface held, but beneath it something shifted, page by page, in a way that only someone sitting close could detect. When he finished, he set the notebook down carefully and looked at it. Not at her, at the notebook. He needed a moment, and she gave it to him. He was with the court during the treaty session, he said. Yes. He was the one who recommended you as the transcribing scribe. She had not known this. It hit differently than she expected, even having suspected something like it. He chose me specifically, she said. He had read your certification file, Cale said. The mark is documented in the Scribe certification records. Anyone with access to those files would have seen it. He paused. He knew what the mark was before you did. She absorbed this. He knew. He knew the mark would respond to the corruption in the null clause. He needed someone in that room who could be blamed for the dissolution looking like destruction. She stopped, and he was the one who ensured the court read it that way. Cale looked at his hands. He pressed them flat on the table, not uncertainty. She would come to learn, but the deliberate act of grounding himself in something physical when the abstract had gotten very heavy. He has served this court for 26 years, he said. He served my father. He served my grandfather. A pause. He was the first person who explained the Oath Network to me. He told me it was what made the Empire just that a magically enforced agreement was an agreement that couldn't be bought away from the weaker party. He stopped. He believed that. When he said it, he believed it. I think he still does, she said. Just a different version of it. Cale looked at her. People don't usually become something unrecognizable, she said. They usually become the most extreme version of what they always were. Solan Veth believed the binding system was justice. He watched it grow into something that served the powerful and trapped everyone else, and he couldn't get it changed from inside it, and he decided that made him right about a different kind of action. She paused. He's not entirely wrong about what the system became. He's catastrophically wrong about what that entitled him to do. Cale was quiet, looking at her now, not the notebook. The 3 lords who died, he said. Yes, she said simply. She didn't add to it. Some things didn't need addition. And the 14 months, he said. He said it differently from how he'd said the other things, a different weight, more personal, as though the fact of her punishment had arrived in the room as something real rather than a line in a file. Yes, she said. Another silence. This one had a different quality from the others. What do you need from me? He said. 3 more days in the archive. I need documentation that holds up in court even when the man being documented is the most trusted legal mind the Empire has produced. She paused. And I need you to keep him occupied. Give him sessions, negotiations, anything that keeps him in official capacity and out of the archive. Done. He stood. At the edge of the table he stopped. Are you all right? The question was so practically asked that she answered it practically. 14 months was a long time to not be, she said. But right now, yes. She paused. Are you? Something happened in his face. Brief. Unguarded, the specific expression of someone caught without the relevant performance prepared. No, he said. Not particularly. He said it flatly. like he'd decided, just then, to stop performing the alternative. The network's failure is accelerating. 3 more instances this week. The anchor is holding, but holding something that's losing integrity beneath it is, he searched for the word, costly. She looked at him and thought about what it meant to be the keystone of something enormous that was quietly cracking. To wake up every day and feel 300 years of accumulated trust pressing through you while someone you had never doubted chipped at the foundations from below. "I'll find all of it," she said. "I'll make it irrefutable." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for the conversation, then nodded once, deliberate, the kind of nod that was not a small thing from him, and left. She pulled the next set of ledgers toward her and went back to work. Chapter 5. He started coming to the archive in the evenings. The first time she assumed he had a reason, a document to retrieve, something administrative that happened to bring him through at the 7th hour. He stayed 40 minutes, working at the far end of the table with dispatches, and left without the conversation going anywhere significant. The second evening was the same. By the 4th, she had stopped assuming it was coincidental. By the 6th, she had stopped thinking about what to call it, and was simply working in the presence of it. The way you work in the presence of something that has quietly become part of the room. He read quickly, and retained well she could tell from the way he cross-referenced documents without going back to the originals. The way someone does when they've already locked the source material in, and are working from memory. His notes were small and cramped and slightly impatient at the corners, the handwriting of a mind moving faster than the pen and not bothering to slow down for it. He didn't fill silence for the sake of filling it. She had noticed this about him in the war room and the archive and everywhere else she'd watched him work. He didn't speak unless he had something to say, and when he did speak, he said it plainly and then stopped. She found this, after 14 months of enforced silence, genuinely restful. On the 6th evening, he asked how she had learned OathScript. She told him about the certification school in the northern city of Pell, run by an arbitrix named Mond, who had the distinction of being simultaneously the most demanding teacher and the most effective one Zara had encountered in any context. She told him about 9 years of treaty work. She told him, without quite planning to, about the pleasure of it. The way OathScript left no room for ambiguity. The specific satisfaction of a document so precisely drafted that no party could later claim they had misunderstood its terms. "You loved it," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was reading, or appearing to read, but his attention was pointed in her direction. "Excessively," she said. "I was told more than once that I took treaties too seriously." He looked up. They were wrong. The political substance of a treaty lives entirely in the language. Imprecise language produces imprecise agreements. Anyone who told you otherwise either hadn't thought it through or had a reason to prefer the imprecision. She looked at the side of his face. "You read documents the same way I do," she said. "I've watched you with the ledgers. You go back to the original clause every time. You don't accept the summary." "My advisors find it tedious," he said, with the dryness of someone who has heard this many times and filed it under times incorrect. She smiled. She had not done that in a very long time, and it surprised her by feeling natural, not something she had to produce, just something that happened. She turned back to her work before he could see it. He saw it anyway. She knew because the quality of his attention shifted, briefly, in the way attention does when it registers something it didn't expect and decides it matters. She said nothing. He said nothing. They worked. The evenings accumulated. 7, then 8. Each one slightly longer than the last. Each one with a little more conversation and a little less distance between the far end of the table and wherever she happened to be sitting. She noticed the progression and did not remark on it. She was a treaty scribe. She understood better than most people that the substance of an agreement developed long before either party was ready to put language to it. On the 8th evening, she found the final piece. It was in the correspondence logs, an administrative file she had passed over twice because it looked routine. A set of letters between Solan Veth and an Outer Islands merchant house, dated 4 months before the treaty session, written in oath script, which was unusual for what looked like informal correspondence. She read the surface layer. Straightforward. Trade arbitration, nothing more. Then she read the secondary layer. She only saw it because she had been reading oath script for 8 consecutive days, and the mark had been burning for the entire period, and she was beginning to understand this, perceiving things she had not previously had the training or the context to perceive. The mark was calibrating. It had been calibrating since she arrived, and this was what it had been building toward. The secondary layer described a plan, a timeline, a methodology, written in Solan Veth's hand, in his formal oath script signature, which meant it carried the same evidentiary weight as any official court record. Irrefutable, written by his hand, in his own script. She sat with it in the archive at the 3rd hour of the morning and let herself feel the full size of it for a moment. 14 months, 3 dead lords, a dead physician who had died knowing. All of it traceable, now, to a single hand, to a man who believed completely in what he was doing, and had done it anyway, and had been careful and patient and warm the entire time. She heard footsteps. Not Lenne's step, not the night guards. She had spent 8 evenings learning the specific rhythm of this particular person's movement through the corridor, and she knew it the way you know sounds that have repeated long enough to become familiar. The door opened. Cale looked at her face and put down the document he was carrying before she had said a word. She held up the letter. He crossed the room and read over her shoulder. He read the surface and then, when she pointed to it, the secondary layer. She could feel him standing behind her, close, present, specific, and felt the mark do something it had not done before in 14 months of wearing it. Not the corruption response heat. Not the directional pull. Something quieter and deeper, like a note finding its corresponding note. She pressed her hand to her sternum instinctively. His hand came forward and touched her shoulder. Not grabbing, not directing. A brief, deliberate wait that said, "I see it. I'm here." "It's enough," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. He didn't move. Neither did she. The archive was very still. "I have watched you work for 8 days," he said. He was still close. Still at that proximity that was neither far nor close, but something decided. "I've watched you dismantle a 2-year deception using nothing except your mind, and a piece of your own history that was taken from you before you could understand it." He paused. "I have been trying to find the appropriate context for what I want to say about that. Have you found it?" "No. I'm going to say it anyway." He came around to stand beside her, not across the table. Beside it. Beside her. "Whatever word you've been using for what has been happening in this archive, every evening I have a different word for it, and it isn't gratitude." She looked at him. He was tired and precise and more honest at the 3rd hour of the morning than he probably intended to be. And he was looking at her with the full directness of someone who has decided this is the moment and is not going to back away from it. "That is extremely poor timing," she said. "I know. You need to sleep." "Yes. And tomorrow is the confrontation." "I know." He didn't move. "I need you to stay in this room for 10 more minutes and not go anywhere." She stayed. She was not, she would admit only to herself, even remotely tempted to do otherwise. The mark was warm and steady. The keep was quiet around them, and 10 minutes was a reasonable amount of time to simply be present without attaching a name to it. She was still there at 25 minutes. Neither of them mentioned it. Chapter 6. They confronted Solan Veth in the morning. KL arranged it in the treaty archive itself, Solan's professional home, the room where his confidence lived. A deliberate choice. When you needed to see what was left of someone after you removed what they were most certain of, you brought them to the place where the certainty lived. Lenne was present, at a discreet remove near the door, ostensibly for documentation, but also, Zara suspected, because Kale trusted her judgment on what to do with a confrontation that went sideways, and he was not certain this one wouldn't. Solan arrived without suspicion. She watched him come in the unhurried ease of him, the warm, professional manner, the complete absence of any performance of innocence because he did not yet know he needed to perform it. He looked at Zara with his kind eyes and inclined his head. Looked at Kyle with the attentive deference of 2 decades of trust. "My lord, I understand there's been a development?" Kale set the letter flat on the table between them, secondary layer visible. Solan looked at it. 3 seconds. Something crossed his face that was not guilt exactly, and not fear exactly, and not quite anything. She had a clean word for the expression of a man who has known for a long time that a room like this was coming, and has now arrived in it, and is deciding, in real time, what kind of person to be here. He sat down. He pulled out the chair and sat as though he had called this meeting himself, folded his hands with the precision of a man organizing his thoughts, and said, "How much do you know?" "Everything," she said. "The null clause, the secondary dissolution method, the correspondence, the full 2-year timeline." She paused. "And why?" Something in him settled at the word times why, as though it was the only thing he had been waiting for. "You found the notation in the old file," he said. "Yes." He looked at her. "Then you understand that what I wrote there isn't wrong," he said. Not as a defense. As a fact he was not prepared to let go of even now, in this room. The network grew into something the original architects never intended. It became a trap for anyone who couldn't negotiate from strength. The small traders, the outer territories, the people who had no choice but to accept terms because oath-binding made those terms permanent. He looked at Kale. "You have been trying to reform it through legal channels for 3 years, channels within a system I built, reviewed by courts whose legitimacy depends on the network staying exactly as it is." "You were aware of the reform efforts," Kale said. "I was aware they would take 15 years and produce half measures," Solan said, while thousands of people remained bound to agreements that were coercing them. He looked at his hands. "I decided that a controlled collapse of the infrastructure was more merciful than 15 more years of documented harm." "And the lords who died?" Zara said. He went quiet. For the first time since he sat down, the composure cracked, not collapsed, but showed a seam, something underneath that had not been managed into smoothness. The null clause was designed to dissolve the treaty, not to harm its parties. The dissolution should have been clean. I did not correctly account for how quickly it would activate after ratification. He stopped. The interaction with the individual oath bonds was faster than my model predicted. I was wrong. They died because I was wrong. "And I spent 14 months in the Vow-Pits," she said, "because you needed someone to carry what you'd done." He looked at her, the warm eyes. She had been bracing herself to hate what she found in them, and found instead something she had not fully prepared for a person who had looked at what they did and had not hidden from it. "I chose you because the mark would make your involvement credible," he said. "I told myself you would be released within a year once the secondary plan was complete, and I could arrange a quiet review." He paused. "I knew at the time that reasoning was insufficient. I chose it anyway." "Yes," she said. "You did." He held her gaze. Then he turned to Kale. "What happens now?" "You stand before the full court tomorrow," Kale said. The evidence is presented in full. The verdict follows from the evidence. He paused. And the review of Zara Fen's conviction begins simultaneously. Her name is restored before the week is out. Solan nodded once. The nod of a man who had been walking toward this room for a long time and was not going to perform something he didn't feel in it. He stood. He looked at Zara one final time with those complicated, warm, real eyes. "I am genuinely sorry," he said. "It is not adequate. I know that. But it is the most honest thing I have left to offer." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. He left with the guards from the corridor. The archive went quiet. Kale sat down. She stayed standing. They looked at each other across the table and the letter and the full weight of 2 years of careful damage and 3 dead lords and 14 months of silence. And neither of them spoke for a while, because what had just happened deserved to be held without words, before words were applied to it. "Tomorrow," she said finally. "Yes," he said. "And after that?" He looked at her. "The network stabilization will take months. The corrupted bindings need identifying, and repairing your mark can help with that." He paused. "And the reforms." Solan was not entirely wrong about what the system became. That problem still needs solving. I need someone who reads oath script at your level and is not invested in the system staying exactly as it is. He held her gaze steadily. "I need you here, for as long as it takes." She looked at him. The mark on her sternum was warm, steady, present, the way it had been since she'd arrived, and she was no longer pretending she didn't know what that warmth included. "I have conditions," she said. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise. "Name them." "My name restored in full. Not suspended. Not pending. Complete restoration of record. 1 finger. Full archive access for the duration of the stabilization work. 2. A formal documented role. Title, terms, rate of compensation. Not advisory capacity. A court position that cannot be revoked by anyone below the sovereign's authority. 3 fingers. She lowered her hand. He looked at her hand, then at her face. "And the 4th?" he said. She hadn't raised a 4th finger. She looked at her own hand for a moment. "That one," she said, "is not a professional condition." He was very still. "I'll say it when the court has finished tomorrow, and your name is not in the middle of a political event," she said. "I'm a scribe. I understand the importance of context." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, "I will be available after the court for a conversation that is not professional in nature." "Good," she said. She picked up her notebook and left the archive before she could ruin the exit by doing something impractical. Chapter 7. The court session lasted 4 hours. She had attended 3 imperial court sessions in her career, and this one was different from all of them. The difference between a session arriving at a verdict and a session performing one. Everyone in the room already knew. The session was the process by which the knowing became official and irrevocable. Solan attended at his own request. Kale permitted it. She thought it was the right call. Solan sat in his chair, the one he had occupied for 26 years, and answered every question with the same directness he had brought to the archive. He did not minimize. He did not deflect. He said what he had done, and why, and what it had cost, and he received the verdict with the composure of a man who had made a specific peace with a specific truth, and was no longer fighting it. When it was done, the court recorder turned to the secondary item and read the formal restoration of Zara Fen's record, including a statement from the sovereign, acknowledging that the original verdict had rested on deliberately constructed false evidence, and that the court was correcting the record completely. She sat in the witness chair and listened to her name being given back to her. She had not known, until this moment, how much weight she had been carrying in that specific place. Kale was looking at her from the sovereign's chair. She looked back. She let herself look back at him directly, without managing the expression, with the full plainness of someone who has decided the performance is over. He inclined his head, very slightly. She inclined hers. The court adjourned. She found him in the corridor outside the chamber, plain stone. The passage between one important room and another, and he was standing in it, in the particular way of someone who has finished moving and has chosen to be here, which meant he was waiting. "The stabilization work begins tomorrow," he said, when she reached him. "Yes. The reform panel will need assembling, 3 months before the first formal session realistically." "I know. And the position title, I want to get the language exactly right, because there's no precedent for a Vow-Keeper in an official court capacity, and the framing matters." "We can discuss the language tomorrow," she said. He was quiet. "The fourth condition," she said. He turned to look at her. In the corridor, light, plain, unorchestrated, just a hallway, he was exactly what he was. Tired. Precise. Carrying the enormous thing slightly less heavily than he had been carrying it a week ago. Looking at her the way he'd been looking at her in the archive for 8 evenings, with the attention he gave to things he intended to understand fully. "I have transcribed agreements between parties who wanted very different things, and I have found the language that held both," she said. "I know what it looks like when 2 parties want the same thing and are using the language of professional conditions to avoid saying it directly." She paused. "I am going to stop doing that." He looked at her. "I want to stay here," she said. "Not only for the work. Not for the restoration or the position or the archive." She held his gaze. "For the evenings. For the person who showed up in that room without explaining why and stayed." She stopped. "For whatever this is," said plainly, without the surrounding language. He reached forward and found her hand, the one she'd had pressed against the mark for 8 days, and held it at the pressure of something deliberately chosen. Not urgent, not tentative. The way you hold something you intend to keep. The mark on her sternum went quiet. Not cold, not absent. The specific quiet of something that has been reaching toward a thing for a long time and has finally arrived. "The language for what this is," he said carefully. "I want to take time getting exactly right." He looked at her with those tired, honest eyes. "But the substance of it is not in question." "No," she said. "It isn't." They stood in the corridor and held the moment the way careful people hold things they don't want to drop. Chapter 8. 3 weeks into the stabilization work, she found the seam. She had noticed it on the 4th day, a line in the archive floor, barely visible, running beneath the edge of the oldest shelving unit. She had noted it and moved on, because she had been focused on the ledgers and there had not been a right moment to ask about it. But it was there every day when she arrived, and the mark had warmed every time she walked over it, and she had been cataloging this information and waiting for the moment it connected to something else. It connected on the 22nd morning. Early, she had started coming earlier each week, before the court day, before anyone else. The mark flared. Not the warmth she had been living alongside. Something sharper and completely directional, pointing down, beneath her feet, not toward the harbor, not toward the war room, not toward anything above the ground, straight down. She set down her pen. She went to find Kale. He was in the war room. He looked at her face when she came in and put down his documents. She had noticed he did this, registered her expression before she spoke and adjusted accordingly, the way someone does when they've been paying attention long enough that the face has become readable. She told him about the seam, about the direction of the mark, about the specific quality of what she'd felt different from anything in the past 3 weeks, different in kind, not just degree. He was quiet for a moment. "There is a lower chamber," he said. She waited. "My father sealed it," The official record says the materials stored there were deteriorating and the conditions couldn't be corrected. He paused. His private record says something different. He stood. I have been meaning to go down there for 3 years and have not had a satisfactory reason. He looked at her. I think you've just found one. The entrance was behind a panel she never would have found without knowing to look. The air below was cold in the way of spaces that have been sealed for a long time still, carrying something older than the stone it was contained in. The chamber was small. Stone walls, a floor older than the archive above, and at its center, on a low plinth, a document unlike anything she had seen in 3 weeks of working the archive. Not paper. Not the formal scrollwork of imperial records. A slab, inscribed in oath script so old it predated the Empire's codified system by at least a century. Rawer, more intuitive. The script of people who were still working out the rules. She read it slowly. The mark burned with every word. She had to interpret rather than simply read. The formal terminology had drifted over 3 centuries. Meanings shifted. Some constructions were guesswork, but the substance was clear. 312 years ago, the founders of the Valdine Empire had made an oath. Not to each other. Not an agreement between parties. An oath to contain something, to keep it bound. And they had anchored that oath not in any one person's blood, but in the network itself, in the accumulation of every binding that came after, each new oath adding its weight to a single foundational seal. She read the last clause and stopped breathing. What does it say? Cale said, from behind her. The Empire was built as a container, she said. She kept her voice even. She needed it even. The Oath Network has always been 2 things simultaneously, a legal infrastructure and a seal. Every agreement ever made in the Valdine system has been, at the same time, a reinforcement of something the founders locked away 300 years ago. She looked at the slab. The sovereigns anchor the keystone position, the reason the sovereign must hold the oath thread. It's not only holding the network together, he said. It's holding the cage, she said. Yes. He was very still. What is inside it? She read the founding clause again, extracted every fragment the old script would give her. The inscription calls it the Endless Arbiter, she said. An entity the founders encountered when they were establishing the first settlement here. Something that had been operating in this region for centuries, at least. Something that offered oaths to people, and then kept what the oaths gave it. It fed on the bindings, he said. Not on the oaths themselves. On the people bound by them. The oath was the mechanism. The person was the anchor. And it used that thread to slowly drain them their sense of will, their capacity to choose, their freedom. She looked at him. It bound people, and then unmade them from the inside. The chamber was absolutely silent. The founders couldn't destroy it, she continued. The inscription describes 3 attempts, so they built the network as a cage instead. Every Valdine oath made since the founding has been simultaneously a legal agreement and a bar on the cage. She pressed her hand against the mark. The Voidspeaker's mark, the Vow-Keeper's mark. The founders put it in the text. They knew the seal would need maintenance. They knew the oath threads would need monitoring and correction. So they seeded the mark into specific bloodlines, ensured there would always be someone who could read the seal's condition and correct it when necessary. Cale looked at her. And the unsworn the network's failure. It isn't only Solan's work. No, she said. As the network weakened, the cage weakened. As the cage weakened, it started pressing outward, against the anchor. It has been feeling the weakening for 2 years, she said, and responding. She looked at the floor. The anchor failure isn't only the network degrading. It's the thing inside the cage pressing back against the only point holding it. From beneath the stone beneath their feet came a sound. Not the shift of old rock, not the earth settling. A rhythm. Deliberate. Patient. Knocking. From the inside. They both looked at the floor. The mark on her sternum went cold, not the cold of absence, but the cold of a signal changing registers. No longer times, this is what you are for. Now something else entirely. This is happening now. There is a way to reinforce the seal directly, she said. She said it before she had fully decided to say it, and she did not walk it back. Not thread by thread. The entire structure, all at once. The inscription describes it. A Vow-Keeper speaks the first oath, the whole founding clause aloud. In this chamber, the mark takes the weight of the respoken binding. The seal is restored. She paused. It should take minutes. Should, he said. She looked at him. The people who wrote this inscription never did it themselves. They designed the mark for someone else to carry. So the times should times is honest. I can't promise you minutes. I can tell you the mechanism is documented, and the mark has been building toward this since I arrived. She met his eyes. I believe it can do this. He looked at the slab, at the floor, at her hand against her sternum. What happens to you when you speak it? The mark becomes the temporary keystone for the duration of the rebinding. Then it releases back into the network. She paused. That is what the text says. But we don't actually know, he said. No, we don't. He looked at her for a long moment. Not the sovereign's face. Not the administrator's face. Just him tired and present, and looking at her with the full weight of someone who has something to lose and is standing in a room where the losing is possible. You don't have to do this tonight, he said. I know. She looked at the floor, at the knocking that had not stopped, at the mark blazing against her sternum. But I'm going to. The knocking wasn't there 3 weeks ago. It's been building. I think our work on the network threads has been telling it something about the state of the seal. It knows repairs are happening. It's trying to get ahead of them. He was quiet for a real moment, not performed consideration, actual thought. She looked at him and said what she had been waiting for the right moment to say, and the right moment, she had decided, was any moment before she started speaking an oath she didn't know the full cost of. Before I start, I want you to know something that has nothing to do with the ring or the sentence or the review. She held his gaze. None of what I imagined about my life after the pits. When I let myself imagine it looked like here. None of it looked like this. She paused. I wanted you to know that before I did something I can't take back. He held her gaze. The tired, honest, careful face. And then he stepped forward. His hand found hers. Not the deliberate archival proximity of 3 weeks. Just his hand in hers, the grip of someone who has decided which direction to face and intends to still be here when it is over. She looked at the slab. She opened her mouth. The first oath was the longest document she had ever spoken aloud. The founding clause and 37 subbindings, each one a thread in the cage, each requiring the full formal register of oath speech she had spent 9 years practicing. She spoke each word with the precision of someone who had learned, the hard way, what imprecise language cost. The mark responded with every clause. Blazed, settled, blazed again. She felt it building through her like a chord that gained a note with every line she spoke, fuller, more resonant, more enormous than she had known she could hold. 22 clauses in, the knocking stopped. The silence was complete. The specific silence of something massive going still. She kept speaking. By the 32nd clause, the mark was so hot she could feel it through her whole chest, the weight of 300 years of accumulated oathcraft channeling through her. The seal incorporating every word she spoke. Kale's grip on her hand was solid and steady, and she felt it the way you feel the ground, not with gratitude, just as the thing that was there, between her and falling. She reached the 37th clause. held the final note of the oath speech until she felt the seal complete. Not a sound, not a physical event, but the specific, unmistakable sense of a structure finding its integrity again. A cage closing. She stopped speaking. The mark went quiet. The chamber was entirely still. She became aware of Kale's hand, of her own breathing, heavier than expected, of the old stone under her feet, and the complete absence of the knocking. "Are you all right?" he said. He asked it the way he always asked it, not courtesy, a real question, the answer to which he intended to use. She assessed honestly. The weight she had been carrying through the oath speech was gone. The mark was quiet, not cold, not absent. The specific quiet of something that has done the thing it was built for, and is resting in the aftermath. "Yes," she said. "Ask me again in 10 minutes. Something moved in his face. Relief, and underneath it, something that had no public name. He was still holding her hand. "We need to go up," she said. "Lenne needs to be briefed. The court session tomorrow should be postponed. And someone needs to document what's in this room because no one should ever be as unprepared for it as we were." She paused. "In 10 minutes. 10 minutes, he agreed. He did not release her hand. She looked at the slab, and the chamber, and the sealed stone beneath them sealed now, tightly, completely, in a way it had not been since Solan began pulling threads. She pressed her free hand against her sternum. Just warmth. Settled. Purposeful. At rest. "The mark is quiet," she said, something in her voice that she did not try to remove. "I noticed," he said. "It has never been quiet before." She pressed her palm flat against it, feeling nothing but the steady warmth of something present and at peace. "I didn't know it was possible." "What does it feel like?" he said. She thought about this honestly. "Like a word you've been searching for," she said. "Like the end of a sentence that needed saying." She looked at him. "Like being in the right place." He was quiet. And then from outside, from the harbor, a bell rang. One bell, then two, then the rapid sequence she recognized as the emergency signal. Vessels in distress. Unexpected arrival of significance. They looked at each other. They went up. The harbor courier was in the war room, road-dusted, wide-eyed in the specific way of someone who has ridden hard and is still managing the meaning of what they are carrying. He held a sealed waterproof canister and looked at Kale and then at Zara and said, "My lord, the message is from the outer islands, from the settlement at Var." He paused. "They said to give it to the Vow-Keeper first." Kale looked at Zara. She took the canister, broke the seal, unrolled the document. The script was Valdine formal, but old founding script, the same notation she had just spent an hour reading on the plinth below. She read it once, read it again. On the second reading her hands went still. "What does it say?" Kyle said. She looked at him, at the document, at the mark, which was no longer quiet. It was burning with a heat entirely different from anything she had felt before. Not the corruption response. Not the proximity warmth. Something new, the feeling of a door that has been locked for 300 years being tried from the other side. The outer island settlement at Var was established 318 years ago, she said. Her voice was steady. She was holding it steady by will alone. 6 years before the Empire, 6 years before the first oath. She looked at him. "This letter is from that settlement." "That settlement has been abandoned for 2 centuries, he said. "Yes, I know." She held up the document. "The last paragraph." He read it. The letter said, "The first oath was the founder's attempt. It was not complete. What they contained was not the endless arbiter. The endless arbiter is the cage. What is inside the cage, what the founders placed there when they built the network. What has been fed by every oath spoken in the Empire for 300 years is something older than any name you have for it. The Vow-Keeper was not made to maintain the cage. She was made to open it. The first oath must not be respoken. It must be dissolved. All of it. The network, the seal, the cage, every binding in the archive above your head. Dissolved, or what has been feeding inside it, will finish what it started 2 years ago and take the network from within. You have until the new moon. 12 days. Do not re-speak the first oath. It is not the solution. It is what the thing inside wants you to do. Zara lowered the document. She turned to Kale and felt the full terrible weight of what she had done 40 minutes ago land in real time. She had re-spoken the first oath. She had sealed the cage. She had done exactly what the letter said was the wrong thing to do. The mark on her sternum, quiet and settled and at peace 20 minutes ago, was screaming. "Kale," she said. "I know," he said. He was reading her face. "Tell me what we do." She looked at the letter. At the archive door beyond which 300 years of bound oaths sat in their drawers, every one of them a thread in a structure she had just reinforced. A structure that was also, according to a message from an impossible source, feeding something that had been growing inside it for 3 centuries. She looked at the mark. She looked at the man beside her, whose blood was the keystone of everything she had just made stronger, who would be the first and most completely destroyed if the letter was accurate and the cage was feeding on what was bound to it. "The first thing," she said, and she said it precisely, the way she said everything that mattered, because the shape of language was the shape of the thing itself, is to find out who wrote that letter. She looked at the outer seal, which she had barely glanced at when she broke it. She looked at it now. The crest was not Valdine. It was not any contemporary territory. It was 318 years old, a founding family's mark, one she had just spent an hour reading on the plinth below. And pressed into the wax beneath it, in an additional secondary imprint, was the shape of the Voidspeaker's mark. Her mark. She sat down. "Someone who carried this mark wrote this letter," she said, "which means there was a Vow-Keeper in the founding settlement." She looked at the letter. "One who apparently did not agree with what the founders did." "Who has been waiting?" Kale said slowly. 318 years for someone with the mark to arrive. "For me," she said. The mark blazed. The harbor bell rang again outside. This time, it did not stop. And from beneath them, from beneath the archive floor, from beneath the lower chamber, from the sealed stone that 40 minutes ago had gone completely silent, the knocking began again. Different this time. Slower, deliberate, rhythmic, in the way that something is rhythmic, when it is not panicking, when it is patient, when it has all the time in the world because it knows that what it is waiting for has already been given to it, and is simply letting the people above it understand what they have done. Zara and Kale looked at each other across the letter, and the mark, and the 12 days, and the full, terrible, specific shape of a mistake made with every good intention and every piece of incorrect information. She pressed her hand flat against the mark. It was not quiet now. It was alive and pointed and pulling downward toward the chamber, toward the plinth, toward the first oath she had just re-spoken, and toward the other half of a sentence she had not known she was in the middle of saying. "There is something else in the text," she said. "In the founding inscription. A section I misread." She said it plainly, without performance, without protecting herself from the admission. "I took it as procedural language. Instructions for the seal's maintenance." She paused. It wasn't. It was a warning. Kale looked at her. She met his eyes. "The founding inscription says the Vow-Keeper carries 2 capacities," she said. "Not 1. The first is what I know reading and correcting corrupted oaths. The second," she stopped. She had to be precise about this. The precision was the only thing that would make the next part survivable. The second is the capacity to dissolve the first oath entirely. Not re-speak it. Dissolve it. All of it. Every thread in the network. Every binding in the archive. Every agreement ever made under the Valdine system. Released simultaneously. The war room was very still. The second capacity, Kale said, is what the letter is asking you to use. Yes. And if you use it. He said it carefully, not as a man who was afraid for himself. As a man being precise because the situation required it. The network dissolves. Every oath in the Empire is released. Yes. Including the anchor, he said. The Sovereign's thread. Yes, she said. Which means... The cage dissolves with the network, she said. Whatever is inside it is no longer contained by the oaths, but it is also no longer fed by them. She looked at the letter. The founding settlement's Vow-Keeper is saying that the thing inside the cage is already too strong to recontain. That re-speaking the first oath what I just did was what it wanted. It wanted the seal reinforced because the seal is not keeping it imprisoned. The seal is what it is eating. She stopped. It has been inside the cage for 300 years. It has been consuming every oath spoken in the Empire. It is not trapped. It is full. And a full cage is stronger than what's holding it, Kale said. Yes, she said. I think so. Yes. Outside, the harbor bell rang its 5th cycle without stopping. Somewhere in the city, people were beginning to wake to the sound of it, to come to their windows and look toward the water and feel the specific unease of an alarm that has not yet explained itself. Kale looked at the map on the war room wall. Every territory, every trade route, every corner of the Empire that existed because 300 years of accumulated oaths said it did. She watched him look at it. If the network dissolves, he said quietly, the Empire not immediately, but it will need to be rebuilt, she said. Every agreement renegotiated. From the foundation. She paused. Solan said the network had grown beyond its original intent. He was right about that. He was just catastrophically wrong about the method of correcting it. She looked at the mark on her sternum, burning and directional and patient. The letter says 12 days. Before what? Before it finishes taking the network from the inside. She held his gaze. At which point the dissolution happens anyway, uncontrolled, with nothing guiding where the released oath threads go when they break. He was quiet for a long time, longer than she expected, and she had come to expect him to be thorough. What do you need to do it? He said finally. She thought about this. About what the inscription said and what the letter said and what the mark was currently doing. I need to go back to the lower chamber, she said. I need to stand at the plinth where I re-spoke the oath, and I need to speak the dissolution. She paused. I don't know the dissolution words yet. They'll be in the text. I'll need to read the second section of the inscription, the part I misread. How long to find and prepare them? Tonight, she said. If I start now. He nodded once. Then he said, I'll be in the chamber with you when you speak it. She looked at him. Kale. The anchor breaks with the network, he said, simply. Without drama. I understand what that means. I'm not asking to be protected from it. He met her eyes. I will be in the chamber with you. She held his gaze for a moment. She understood, she thought, why some things were better carried in silence for a while, before they were handed to language. All right, she said. She picked up the letter, picked up her notebook, looked at the door to the archive, and the long night of inscription reading ahead of her, and the 12 days, and the weight of 300 years of bound oaths, and the specific, impossible, necessary thing she was going to have to say. Out loud, in a chamber beneath an empire, in the voice she had spent 14 months not being allowed to use. I'll need more ink, she said. Lenne appeared in the doorway. She always appeared precisely when she was needed, which Zara had come to suspect was not coincidence, but a skill Lenne had spent 30 years perfecting. "Already here," Lenne said. She set the ink on the table, looked at both of them with the composed attention of a woman who has absorbed the size of what is happening and has decided her job is to make the next 12 days as manageable as possible, and left without saying anything else. Because Lenne understood, as Zara did, as Kale did, as everyone who had ever spent real time with very large things understood, that there were moments when the most useful thing you could say was nothing. Zara looked at Kale one last time. 12 days, she said. 11 now, he said. It is past midnight. She managed something close to a real smile and went back to work. A note for viewers. You think Zara re-spoke the first oath and sealed the cage. She didn't seal it. She fed it. What has been living inside the Empire's oath network for 300 years is not weakened. It is not contained. It is full 3 centuries of bound oaths, every promise made under the Valdine system, every thread of human intention sealed in wax and blood, all of it, consumed. And now it knows the Vow-Keeper is here. 11 days left. The dissolution, if Zara speaks, it releases every oath in the Empire simultaneously, every trade agreement, every military alliance, every marriage contract, every land claim, every promise sealed in 300 years of Imperial history, including the one Kale Dorn made when he took the Sovereign's oath, including the one Zara made, without words, without wax, without a single piece of documentation. The ones those don't need. There is also a second Vow-Keeper, someone who carried this mark 300 years ago, someone who disagreed with the founders, someone who has been waiting in a settlement that has been abandoned for 2 centuries for exactly this moment. That second Vow-Keeper is not finished speaking yet. Part 2 is already underway. You cannot afford to miss what she says next.